Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are covering X of Swords Creation, right? This X of Swords event is a big event. This is a 22-part series. I have no idea what all is in store for us here. I really have no clue. I have no earthly clue. But here's the thing. We're going to cover X-Men number 12, and we're going to cover this, because in typical Jonathan Hickman fashion, one rolls directly into the other. And it's one of the reasons why I held off on recording this, just because of the fact that after reading X-Men issue number 12, it became obvious that X of Swords was just going to roll over, and it'd be easy to kind of record them at once, as opposed to trying to record, one and then like waiting a week and trying to record the other, because then it would end up throwing people off, right? So what this first part does, because we're doing like so much here, because we have so much going on, what we're going to do here is kind of focus on the main points, right? And one of the main points here is we basically end up picking up with Summoner. Now Summoner here is kind of hanging out with a few of the X-Men that are around there, or at least kind of the newer generation and so on and so forth, but he's met by the arrival of Apocalypse. And what this is really designed to do is for us to kind of get this explanation on the nature of Arakko, right? Now, the idea behind this is that when it comes to Arakko and Krakoa, as we're told here, that initially they were one singular island, and that much we already knew, right? We already knew that Okara was basically the name of this Pangea type, chunk of land, and that when this whole thing existed, at some point in time, it was just a single landmass. But then somebody managed to get their hands on the Twilight Sword. Now, we're not told who it was that was in possession of the Twilight Sword, but this is a big deal, because the Twilight Sword is the weapon of Surtur, right? Meaning somebody got a hold of Surtur's weapon and then used it to quite literally cleave Okara in half, to cut the island in half. The problem with this is that when that happened, demons and dark beings started rising from this massive fissure. And so in order to bring an end to this, in order to stop this basic, this invasion more or less, Apocalypse assembled his 4 horsemen, and they basically attacked and fought back the demon horde. But the problem with this was that in order to seal the rift, Apocalypse's 4 horsemen had to be confined within Arakko and basically sealed off, right? And sealed away. That's why we've never heard of them before, right? Because they've literally just been left inside this landmass this entire time. And so with all the various forces of Apocalypse being sealed here, in addition to his 4 horsemen, they basically had to make life on their own. And when they arrived down here, what they started to realize is that this place was a dark and horrible place, right? It was more or less hell. Now, Hickman doesn't say as much. He doesn't tell us this is like the realm of Mephisto. And in fact, it just seems to be a dark dimension, right? Just one of the many dark dimensions that exist out there in Marvel Comics. It's just one that hasn't really been explored yet. But with all these demons and all these horrible entities out there, the first thing that the forces of Apocalypse did was basically find a way to keep themselves protected. And so they essentially used their ability to tap into sorcery, and these mutants who were basically summoners, the ability to use witchcraft, so alchemy, that kind of a thing, started erecting these 10 towers. And these 10 towers were basically kind of like these borders, right? So we can largely assume that they created some kind of a protective field around this giant chunk of land, and that's where all the forces of Apocalypse resided. Now, Apocalypse's wife at the time, a woman named Genesis, was part of these forces who were confined here. And the result was that you ended up seeing the horsemen of Apocalypse basically having their own offspring. In this instance, we ended up having War, basically, who became the mother of Summoner. Now, Genesis became the de facto leader of this group here. There was a council of sorts, but all the indications here are that Genesis was kind of the final voice, right? That there's a council, but it's like anything else in this world. If you go high enough, you always reach one person. And that's what it was here, right? When you go high enough among the ranks, you get to one person that it basically has absolute authority. And that's what ended up happening. Now, the idea of Genesis was to basically travel outward and to annihilate their enemies, right? Instead of basically living in kind of a safe haven they'd created for themselves, to go out there into Arakko and to slaughter their enemies wherever they found them. The problem with this is that they were basically fighting against the forces of Amnith, is essentially what it's called. But Hickman kind of plays this fast and loose. We're not really told if Amnith is a person or Amnith is an ideology, right? We're not really given any differentiation there. We're simply told the forces of Amnith, or the forces of Amenth, rather. But the idea here is that during this time, or at least somewhere around this time, you ended up having what was basically the greatest of their healers, right? This guy who was basically wielding the white sword. And the whole purpose behind this is that this guy had basically set out and he was annihilating the forces of Amenth as well. The problem with this was the longer he fought, the more he became engulfed in the war that they were fighting. And so the power of his sword, the power of purity was such that he had his 100 warriors. And what would happen is they would would go out, they would fight against these forces, and basically all his warriors would die. And the power of the white sword is that it would all resurrect them, and they would go right back out again the next day. The issue is that, again, they became kind of lost in their conflict. It's almost like Thor when he goes into his warrior's madness, and he doesn't really able to determine friend from foe. That's exactly what happened here. These guys were not able to determine or able to look at the forces of Genesis and see them as allies. They were all deemed as being enemies in the face of White Sword, right? And so what ends up happening here is that once they face off against this threat, who was at one point the greatest of their healers, their numbers were absolutely crushed, right? Literally, they were pushed to the forces of Genesis were pushed to near extinction. And so traveling back to their base of operations, ultimately, you ended up seeing a character by the name of Iska who showed up, and Iska was considered a traitor, but not by choice. She wasn't a traitor because of the fact that she was like, this group sucks, they obviously lost, there's no way they can win, I'm just gonna defect. Her mutant power is such that she cannot lose, right? And so the idea here is that if she's in a situation like this, and she recognizes the forces of Genesis cannot win against the forces of Amenth, and they cannot win against the forces of White Sword, then her mutant power drives her to ally with the winning side. And that basically drove her to become a traitor and to ally herself with Amenth. Now, this is Jonathan Hickman basically saying that Amenth is the one who's going to come out on top. There's no possible way for anybody else to win. It's basically telling us like what's going to happen. And that's exactly what does play out. That when Iska shows up, she essentially says that Annihilation, basically the god general of Amenth, has challenged her to a duel. And the way this duel will play out is that if Annihilation falls, if Annihilation loses in this battle to the death, then the forces of Amenth will back off and they will leave these guys to do their own thing. But if Genesis falls, then it leaves the way open for the forces of Amenth to invade, right? And that's exactly what goes on here. That when this battle takes place, the fight between Genesis and Annihilation is intense, right? It's an extreme battle, but ultimately Genesis falls. And when she falls, this leaves the way or kind of paves the way for the forces of Amenth to basically start invading into these territories. Now, it's not done overnight. You're talking about a very large chunk of land. And so this battle stretches on for quite some time. Not only that, it's not as though Genesis fell and the entire place was, had to lay down their arms and let themselves be invaded. They fought as best they could, but they were hopelessly outmatched. It was really just a battle of attrition, right? Just the numbers just kept coming and coming, and these guys just couldn't hold off, any longer. And so in a last ditch effort, they ended up sending Summoner to the main Marvel universe, basically sending him to the surface world in hopes that he could find Apocalypse, and that in finding Apocalypse, he'd be able to bring the full might of his power down to Arakko and then basically cleanse everything. That Apocalypse could be the one to face off against Annihilation and then probably defeat Annihilation, or possibly even go as far as to defeat Amenth. And so in order to achieve this, what you ended up getting was Apocalypse, who basically allied or brought back Banshee, who of course has the ability to, sonic energies, more or less, the ability to kind of emanate a sonic voice, as well as Unus the Untouchable. Now, Unus the Untouchable is kind of a stupid character, or at least he was, but that's one of the cool things about what Hickman's doing, is Hickman's very, very good at taking characters that would otherwise be considered laughable and turn them into somebody interesting. And that's what he's done here. Unus the Untouchable is a guy that basically has a force field. He can make a force field around himself. And the only way to get past his force field is to somehow manage to take over his mind. That's the only way to really do it. Short of that, there's no real way to get past his force field and to get to him directly. And so they're really designed to be sent there as scouts, right? To basically report on everything that's going on. And then at the same time, Apocalypse intends to essentially bring together the full forces of Krakoa and then travel into Arakko and then liberate the entire territory, right? Liberate all the land. And so what you end up doing here is switching over to the X of Swords event itself, right? And this basically opens up with the 4 horsemen of Apocalypse, who look to appear to be leading the forces of Amenth, right? Who look to basically be the ones who are kind of leading this whole charge. And what you end up getting are, is really just kind of the king of the mutants, or at least the king of this one territory. And the idea is to kind of send out somebody to basically alert Saturnine, to make Saturnine aware of what's going on. So at the very least, Saturnine can send her own forces, to kind of try to quell this threat, to bring the power that she possesses to bear on this particular force. The issue with this is that as that happens, you end up having this one particular scout, this one guy, this messenger, who's taken out. And following that, he basically washes up on the shores of Saturnine, right? He washes up on the Starlight Citadel. Now, a little bit of explanation here for those of you guys who are unfamiliar with this. This Starlight Citadel is both a base of operations as well as kind of a holy place, right? So the idea is that in Marvel Comics, you have what's called the Captain Britain Corps. Most of you guys know about that. And you have one Captain Britain in every universe, right? And the idea here is that they all basically gain their abilities from, well, previously it was Merlin and then his daughter Roma, but at the moment it more or less kind of seemed to be Saturnine. Now, in the aftermath, or at least during the events of Jonathan Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers, we saw the entirety of the Captain Britain Corps was wiped out, right? They were basically all destroyed, save for Brian Braddock. And so Jonathan Hickman maintains that. There are probably a few things you need to know in between, just because of the fact that he references things that happened, but the idea is that Saturnine is basically told Arakko has fallen, right? This land has basically fallen here. And Saturnine seems to know all this stuff. Now, this all really does kind of make sense just because of the fact that Saturnine is part of what's called the Omniversal Development Court. And the Omniversal Development Court, we've talked about that before, specifically during our video on Mad Jim Jaspers, but the Omniversal Development Court is basically this kind of council, this court more or less that exists. And the whole purpose is to monitor different realities that exist out there. Now, in the early days, when Saturnine was first moved into her position of becoming the Omniversal Magistrix, her job was to look through every single universe and make sure that they were all following some kind of form or function, right? Which is to say that mutants arrive around the same time, right? Like mutant powers manifest around the same time within, roughly about 100 years or so, something along those lines. I'm just kind of throwing out an arbitrary number. There's nothing to specifically say 100 years, but to make sure that like every Earth has some version of like the Avengers, different things like that. It's kind of the purpose that it serves. That's why the story of Jim Jaspers was so important, because during that time, you ended up having Jim Jaspers, who created the Fury, who wiped out all the superheroes on Earth in his own universe, Earth 238. But Saturnine didn't know that. And so that basically led to her initiating the big push, which pissed off Jim Jaspers. He initiated the Jaspers Warp. And in order to prevent the Jaspers Warp from basically tearing apart the entire multiverse, his whole reality had to be destroyed, right? So that's kind of the role that she plays, is kind of safeguarding and monitoring the multiverse, and really even the Omniverse, if you kind of want to look beyond the bigger scope here. But that's why she basically says, like, I need the tarot cards, because if Arakko has fallen, that means that the god Amenth, or whatever he is basically making his move, and there's really no one there to stand in his way. And the way this is kind of explained, or the way she kind of plays this off, is that this has been foretold, right? This has all kind of been foretold, and everything is coming to pass. And so it seems as though this is sort of a scenario that's been prophesized to take place, and is finally coming around, right? It's actually finally happening. So it's like the Octescent story from Marvel Comics, but on a much grander scale, if you guys get what I'm talking about. But where you end up having what's called the Arakko point, right? Basically the access point to Arakko, this portal that Banshee and Unis the Untouchable and them pass through, where you end up having a few characters here. Suddenly, this giant beast emerges from the hole, with Summoner riding it and holding Banshee. And what he basically says is, Banshee's dying. Banshee is basically dying here. And so it looks like whatever their effort was, as soon as they went down there, everything popped off. And so Banshee's body is, of course, taken to the healing gardens inside Krakoa, and then Apocalypse asks Summoner what in the world had happened, and Summoner kind of basically says, like, we got in there, we were ambushed on our, on the way to Arakko. We didn't even get to where we were supposed to be. Like, Unis the Untouchable has been taken prisoner, like their war has begun. And so with that being the case, Apocalypse takes Summoner to the Quiet Council, right? Magneto, Charles Xavier, all these guys, and basically tells them everything that's going on. The problem with this is that what you end up having is Apocalypse, you have the kind of case being made to Apocalypse that in order for this plan to work, right? In order for access to Arakko to have been achieved, for all of this to have kind of come together, Apocalypse had to make that portal in Otherworld. And we saw that during the story of Excalibur, right? That's why that portal was created, so that all of this could be achieved. That if they needed to access Saturnine, they could travel through the Krakoan portal to Otherworld, and then access the Omniversal Development Court and the Starlight Citadel, and meet with Saturnine if they needed to. The other part of this is that because Apocalypse did that, and he constructed this portal directly to Arakko, this was done without the approval of the Quiet Council. He acted of his own accord, but he saw this as an absolute necessity. And so where Summoner basically tells his story in saying that Unis the Untouchable was taken prisoner, Banshee barely escaped with his life alongside Summoner, that they have to essentially get back, they had to grab Apocalypse and marshal as many forces as they can to bring this war to an end. The Quiet Council is largely concerned about this, initially because they're going into a foreign territory, but also because there's some disagreement here in terms of how it should be happened, right? One of the big concerns that Storm has is, for example, Unis the Untouchable, that he is a mutant. He's part of the Krakoan population. They can't just leave him behind, right? The whole philosophy of no one being left behind. But at the same time, they can't simply just walk in there because they don't really know what all's going to go on. And to take a force of that size and to go into Arakko would leave Krakoa unguarded. Now, a really good point is brought up by Kitty Pryde when she kind of looks around and she says, okay, but if the concern that we have here is that we leave ourselves vulnerable, right? We leave ourselves vulnerable passing through there, then why don't we simply just go through like the portal to Otherworld, right? Why don't we simply go through the portal to Avalon? We can basically kind of close that portal off. We can keep enough forces here to keep ourselves safe, to make sure the island doesn't fall or anything like that. But for whatever forces decide, if the forces of Orcus or whatever it is that's out there, if they want to follow behind us, then they can't, right? We pass through the portal to go to Avalon, we shut the portal off, and everything's done. The issue that Apocalypse has is, one, that cannot get us directly there, and two, the external gate, the gate that exists that goes to Arakko, Krakoa does not have full control over it. And so that's when the Quiet Council says, then we should destroy the portal, right? Like, we should destroy that portal that goes to Arakko. It sucks that we're going to end up leaving Unis the Untouchable behind, but we should shut it off. We cannot get involved into this massive conflict. We're still assembling ourselves here. We've still got to role to play in the world at whole. We still got all of our own campaigns, right? You know, the various pills and medicines that they're getting out there. They have all kinds of threats they have to face off against. The mutants are not in a position to basically vacate Krakoa, take some of the most powerful characters into some unknown realm in the hopes that they can even survive, let alone defeat forces, whatever those forces happen to be, with whatever power they happen to possess. There's too many unknowns. There's too many variables. And what you know, scouts they did send in there have been captured like that, right? So what hope do the rest of these guys have? Not only that, when you're traveling into a dimension like that, there's no guarantees the power you have will even work, right? There's no guarantee that Magneto's control over magnetism will work, right? There's no guarantee that'll be there. It could be all the mutants pass through there and their powers get shut down. They're just regular humans running around there, just running and hiding and hoping they don't die with no real means of return. And so when it's put to a vote, should we destroy the Arakko Gate, everybody aside from Apocalypse and Summoner and Storm basically vote to destroy the gate. And so ultimately what ends up happening here is the entire Quiet Council is overridden by Krakoa himself, right? And Krakoa kind of makes this point in saying, understand, you guys are guests here, right? I allow you to be on this island, but if you're going to be on this island, then you are what amounts to house guests. And a man doesn't walk into another man's home and start telling him what's what. It doesn't work that way. And if that's how you guys want to be, then I can kick you guys off, right? I can make my island inhospitable. I can have all the plants start producing carbon dioxide and make this place unbreathable for you. I can do any number of things, right? And so if this is going to be the case, then understand that Krakoa, or that Arakko Gate stays open. It does not close. And that's the definitive statement offered by, or really made by Krakoa. And there's no real way, I mean, I guess the Quiet Council could ignore him, but the repercussions would be extreme. And so in response to that, Apocalypse is basically told, all right, fine, you can do your mission if you need to, but you will have it without the authority and without the support of this council, meaning you're on your own. That's basically what it is, right? And so Apocalypse says, okay, fine, then I will ask for volunteers. And so we actually end up getting some pretty formidable characters here for volunteers. You get Lorna, so basically you get Polaris. You end up getting Havoc, who of course can channel ambient solar energy. You have, you know, Apocalypse and Summoner, of course, but then you also have Beast and you have Archangel. Now here's an important thing to understand here when it comes to Beast and Archangel. They're not the heaviest of hitters, right? Not by any stretch of the imagination. But when you combine them with somebody like Siren, who of course is basically Banshee, you know, more or less has the same powers as Banshee, you have the intelligence of Hank McCoy, you've got the pride, and you've got the, you know, what abilities, you know, Archangel has. He's only really there because he doesn't really trust Apocalypse, right? He's like, I don't really trust him. He's always up to something. I want to make sure he doesn't do anything, and if he does, then I'm going to go ahead and take him out. But then they're also basically met by Monet St. Croix. And Monet St. Croix is probably the most prominent, probably the most interesting of the characters here, because she's kind of this combination of like standard superhero abilities and then some of the things that Wolverine has. For example, she has enhanced hearing, she can see at night, she has telepathy to a degree, she has some really cool powers, right? Some really cool abilities. She's sort of a hodgepodge, kind of a Frankenstein character in terms of her abilities, what she can do, and so on and so forth. And so once everybody essentially dives in, right? Once they arrive on the scene, they see this massive attack being launched on the Starlight Citadel, right? This being launched in Otherworld on the Starlight Citadel itself. And then you end up having, you know, Unis the Untouchable, of course, who's being strung up and all that kind of stuff. And Apocalypse witnessing everything that's going on and seeing that his children are leading all of this, Apocalypse actually cries because he regrets all of this. He regrets that his kids are doing this, right? And so at the end of the day, he says, like, you know, these are my children, right? They're my horsemen, they're my children. It's my job to make sure they're okay. And so while all that's going on, at least everything going on in Otherworld, you end up picking up here with Rachel Summers and Cable. And the idea is that they're reading the mind of Banshee in order to uncover everything that had gone on. And this is kind of interesting here because you would think this would be the most obvious solution, that Apocalypse trusts Summoner, right? Because Summoner is basically his grandchild, it's his grandson. But you would think that other people would say, okay, let's verify the authenticity of what it is that's being said here by Apocalypse and Summoner. Let's basically scan the mind of Banshee and find out what these memories are. And as soon as Rachel and Cable dive into his mind, they begin to realize that something's off, right? That something's not quite right here. When they're basically picking up with Banshee and they're picking up with Summoner and they're picking up with Unis the Untouchable entering into this realm, something seems to be off. And so picking up with the current moment, you basically have Apocalypse who approaches his children and says, like, I can't believe that this is real, right? That you live. It's more than I'd hoped for. This has always been my dream. And they kind of approach him and say, you know, we don't want to see you as the man that you are now. We want to see you as the man that we remember. A man who stood on his 2 feet, a man who was prideful, who was a warrior king, you know, a warrior god. We want to see you that way. And of course, Apocalypse stands and says he has so many things that he wanted to say, right? He has so many questions. And he says, tell me of Arakko. Tell me, if it fell, by what miracle have you returned to me, right? Like, what happened here? How did you get to this place? How did you survive all this time? Because I thought all of you guys were gone. And so they basically tell Apocalypse, like, they don't really imagine this hell that they've gone through as being any kind of a miracle. But ultimately, like, you ended up having having Genesis, who basically fell, so the wife of Apocalypse, their mother, is essentially gone. And that ultimately they became who they were because there was no way to avoid it, right? There was no way to avoid this hellish landscape that in order to survive, you had to fight. But for them, it's not necessarily the worst thing, because remember, Apocalypse's entire life is bent on the idea of testing, right? Only the strong deserve to survive. That's kind of the undercurrent with this whole thing. And that's why they say, like, regret is for the weak, right? We were born strong. In that place, only the fit survive. And here we are, right? Only the strongest are able to survive. And that's why we survive, because we are among the strongest. And from there, he's basically asked, do you know what it is that kept us alive all this time, right? War approaches them and says, do you know what kept us alive all this time? It was not love. And in turn, they kill Apocalypse. And it's like, holy cow, like, it's the most insane thing. And then you pick up with Rachel and you pick up with Cable, they're still probing through the mind of Banshee, and they come to the realization that Summoner was a plant. He set all this up. He was never on the side of Apocalypse. He was a means to an end to get Apocalypse here and then to bring Apocalypse down. And as they're poking through and as they're kind of looking around in the whole scenario, they end up coming across Saturnine. And Saturnine immediately picks up on the fact that they're trying to read her mind, even if it is Saturnine in the past, right? And before all this is happening in the current moment. And Saturnine says, you're looking in the wrong place, right? Like, you're looking for the wrong thing. A great game is afoot. And if you want to play, if you want to win, then this is what you want. This is what you need. Find it. And she shows them this thing. Now, this is important because this is Saturnine's mind basically crossing time and space, right? It's like if you read your dad's mind, right? And it's like if right now today at 7:28 p.m. on September 23rd, you read your dad's mind and you ended up reading his mind, or you experienced his memory from like a year and a half ago when he was talking to his boss, and his boss started talking to you, like he realized you were there and started talking to you. That's the kind of power that we're talking about, communicating through memories. It's absolutely insane. Like, it's a crazy display of power, but Saturnine is an exceedingly powerful character, right? She's wildly capable in her own right. And so where Saturnine is called by her forces and asked, are you going to do anything about this here? Ultimately, her response is, no, I'm probably not going to. And it's not because Saturnine doesn't care, it's because there's a bigger picture going on here. There's a much bigger event taking place. And so with Apocalypse incapacitated, this is a huge deal because the queen on the chessboard is basically down, right? It's basically out. And all anybody can really do is marshal what forces they have. That's the power of Apocalypse. If Apocalypse were at 100% full strength, he probably could have ended this threat in no slow fashion, right? All it would take is for him to grow himself to like 2,000 feet tall and just start blasting everything with massive amounts of energy, right? That's the kind of power that we're talking about here. And so in response to that, you end up having Cable, who leaves Rachel Summers. He goes running to Cyclops and Jean Grey and says, you have to see this thing, right? You have to see this. And so because of the fact that this object is in the mind of Cable, right, in the sense that he recalls it from his memory, Jean Grey reads his mind, passes the thoughts to Cyclops, and basically says, we have to go find this artifact. Whatever this artifact is, right? We don't know what it is, but they're like, we have to go find it. This energy source, this device, whatever it is, Saturnine sent us there. And if Saturnine says it's a thing we need to find, then it means it's a thing we need to find. There's a great, big, huge set of events taking place here, and we don't know what it is. For those of you guys who are coming to this from like our recent videos on Avengers and New Avengers, this is how Hickman does things, right? Like, in hindsight, we can kind of just roll through Avengers and New Avengers and make sense of everything as we go along because we knew it all, right? After having read the whole thing, like, we basically knew. We read a story that was already completed from beginning to end. With this, we don't know how this is going to end. And this is the issue that we run into with Jonathan Hickman. We end up, I know a lot of you guys have a lot of questions. We end up with more questions than we have answers to. It's just the nature of Jonathan Hickman. But that's what I love about it, is it all pays off, right? It all works. You end up having Monet St. Croix, who manifests her telepathic ability and starts talking to Saturnine and says, you have to do something about this, right? Like, you can't just let this massive battle take place with all these people dying and do nothing. You have to get involved somehow. And the response of Saturnine is, I will do what I want, when I want, and how I want in this place. And you or nobody else here is going to tell me what it is that I need to do. If I want to get involved, I'll get involved. If I do not get involved, trust that there's a reason for it. But ultimately, the X-Men team doesn't really seem to hear these words. And so it leads to Polaris basically saying, if she doesn't want to get involved, we'll make her get involved. And so she ends up using her control of her magnetism to literally start pulling apart the Starlight Citadel in order to force Saturnine's hand, in order to force her to get involved. And so what it does here is it transitions over to Jean Grey and to Cyclops and to Cable. And the problem that they have is that once they arrive on this location, they of course meet advanced idea mechanics scientists. And what this looks like is that it looks like it's on the Orcus space station, right? They basically gone right back into the lion's den from where it all kicked off with House of X to attain whatever this device happens to be. And so in the midst of all this, Saturnine basically says, okay, like, she recognizes the Cyclops and Jean and Cable have finally accessed this device, and she says, now I can make my move. And she pops back down and immediately stops everybody, right? Like everyone stops fighting. Now, this is the power that Saturnine has. By turning to various magics and things at her disposal, she's able to essentially, I don't know, I wouldn't necessarily go as far as to say warp reality, but she's certainly able to impose her will on everybody there. And it's one of these things where as we kind of bounce back and forth, you end up having Cable, who uses his energy sword, which is basically a lightsaber, let's just call it a lightsaber, to cut a hole through this energy sword, through this sphere to access whatever it is that's inside. But then you have her asking the question to these various forces, to annihilation and so on, like what foolishness would bring you here and lead you to believe that you could somehow topple me inside this realm? Like here, I am God. Why would you do this? Of what foolish effort would this be? Like why try this in the first place? And the response is because we serve our Lord and Liege, right? Because we were sent here by our Lord and Liege, presumably Amenth, right? Like we serve on his behalf. And if you kill me, that's fine. Like it's not a huge deal. You know, like I'll die, but somebody else will take my place. And we will throw as many people as we need to in order to get to you, because our goal is not to access the Starlight Citadel. That's not where we stop. Our goal is to access the main Marvel universe and to take over Krakoa, right? To basically take back what's rightfully ours, and then presumably expand that sphere of power and influence back out into the rest of the world. We don't really know what that intention is. I don't believe it's simply that mundane and that basic. That seems way too simple for somebody like Jonathan Hickman, right? There's something much bigger going on here. And so what ends up happening is the various superheroes who are here are sent on what amounts to a kind of journey, right? They're basically told, travel to these locations and grab these weapons, and you will fight these forces when you get back, right? It's basically setting up an honorable duel. That's really what it is. It's setting up this kind of honorable duel to ensure that if this whole thing happens, that it happens according to a preordained plan. Again, we don't know anything about this plan. We don't know anything about this stuff. We simply just know that it exists out there. But we do know that these various weapons are weapons that we have heard of before, right? The Twilight Blade, the Red Vermilion, the Red Sword of War, Colony, the Black Bone of Amduat, Seducer, Pog, Purity, Alluvium, and the Muramasa Blade. Like, we know these weapons. Most of them we know, some of them we don't, but we know these things, right? They simply go by different names, right? The, Muramasa, the Sword of Might, the Starlight Sword, Grass Cutter, the God Killer Sword, Warlock, the Soul Sword, just these different names for these different weapons that we're all familiar with. The Light of Galador, the Skybreaker, these are all exceedingly powerful weapons, right? These 10 swords have to be accessed. They have to be taken. And when those swords are brought in, then in turn they'll be used for whatever battle, this massive conflict is going to lead to, this kind of final conflict, more or less, this kind of final war, this final, battle. But nonetheless, it's Jonathan Hickman at his best, right? It's Jonathan Hickman basically saying, hey guys, some crazy things are going to happen. And then like we have a boatload of questions, and it's like, but I mean, like, what is all this? Like what do you, okay, a lot of things are going to happen, but like, what's going to happen, Jonathan Hickman? Like what's the whole idea behind all this? And Hickman's like, you just got to wait and see. That's all it is. That's really all this is this a teaser for a great big huge event that's gonna play out. But it's Jonathan Hickman at his finest. So if you find yourself frustrated, if you find yourself confused, don't worry, you're not alone, but stick with me. I promise, stick with me and we will get through this, because it will prove to be something epic. Because if I'm a betting man, right? If I'm a betting man, I will bet all the money in my pockets to all the money in your pockets that we're probably going to end up seeing Mad Jim Jasper somewhere along the line in this Jonathan Hickman X-Men run. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.